Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us this evening. My name is Kate, and I am part of the team that brings you Random House events. We are so excited to have Dr. Devon Price with us this evening to discuss unlearning shame. We'll be getting started in just a few minutes, but I just wanted to cover some housekeeping notes before we do that. So to start, I'd like to remind everyone that we are on Zoom meeting. So we'd love to have people turn on their camera. We'd love to see your smiling faces, but we do ask that you please remain muted unless otherwise prompted. We'd also love to have you join us in the chat. We'd love to hear where you're joining us from, your excitement for the book, and your thoughts on tonight's conversation. We just ask that you do please stay respectful. Closed captioning is available. Just click CC at the bottom of your Zoom screen. And finally, please feel free to drop any questions you have for Devon in the Q&A box, also at the bottom of your Zoom screen. We are so excited for tonight's conversation, and I'm going to pass it right over to Devon so we can get started. Thanks again for joining us.
Right. Hello, everyone. God, there's already so many familiar names in the chat. Thank you so much, everyone, for being here. Especially for the people who should be tired of hearing from me already. But thank you for again making the time. And let me just do. I'm a professor, so y'all know I have a PowerPoint for you about this book. We're gonna talk a little bit about some of the ideas in Unlearning Shame today for the kind of first half ish of the hour, and have a few little sample exercises from the book and materials and stuff. And then we'll dive into the Q&A. I know some of you already submitted questions beforehand, so I can go through some of those, but also please, any questions you have that you want that come up to you now throughout this, please feel free to put them in the Q&A, put them in the chat, and we'll try to keep an eye on that. So yeah, with that, because I tend to cram too much into things, which is why my books are always long and dense. Same thing's kind of true with my PowerPoint. So we'll probably be more like 35 minutes on this, so I won't waste any time in getting into talking about this book. So when I think about it, when I kind of zoom out, I think a lot of my work in general really is about shame in various ways. So Laziness Does Not Exist, my first book, a lot of that book is about the shame that capitalism really instills in us of feeling like we are not productive enough, no matter what we do. And just that kind of inherent shame that comes from defining a person's worth by their productivity. You're always kind of in the hole if that's how we're evaluating human worth. And Unmasking Autism, I think the shame connection there is maybe even more direct. It's all about the shame of being disabled and not necessarily knowing it for a long time. And so not being able to explain the mismatch between what's expected of you in society and how you actually work and what's good for you. And just the shame that comes with, feeling the need to hide that. So shame is something that's been on my mind in my work for a really long time. But it really came to the fore for me with this book for a bunch of different reasons. Um, one of the main reasons, gosh, this bar is still in the way. Sorry. How do I make this one disappear? It was disappearing before. Um, so in 2020, when this book was kind of first starting to just be a kernel in my mind, I was dealing with a lot of shame around being trans, and to enough of a degree that I medically detransitioned for about a year, starting in like late summer, early fall of 2020. I was feeling a lot of shame about other people's reactions to me and felt somehow personally to blame for the fact that I now existed in this place that was really inscrutable and hard for other people to read, gender wise, that kind of freaked them out, or made them not know how to respond to me, or even just kind of ignore that I was in the room, just, both in terms of my close relationships, as well as just moving throughout the world and interacting with other people. And it was a really difficult time in my life. And it was also something that I didn't really talk about with anyone else because I was both ashamed of where I had gotten myself and who I was. And I was also ashamed of the fact that I felt ashamed because it felt like kind of a betrayal somehow of like trans liberation and like a failure at being an adequately confident trans person. So there was a lot of kind of shame coming at me from all directions, really. Of course, this feeling wasn't actually just a personal neurosis. It was an internalization of a lot of societal forces and systemic forces that were really coming to a head in the culture and had been for a while, but were starting to reach even more of a tipping point in that year. 2020 was the first year that any law in America had ever been proposed to restrict access to transition-related healthcare. There had never been a law proposed attempting to restrict those things up until that point, which is kind of shocking to think about. And it, of course, has only become a massive battleground culture war issue in the years since then. These are just examples of some of the bills that have come out in the last couple of years that are focused on restricting access to trans healthcare, banning youth access to transition related care, adult access to transition related care. Um, and a lot of these laws passing, especially in my home state of Ohio, where I'm from, really, to me, called to mind memories of how it felt being a queer teenager in the early 2000s when a lot of gay marriage bans were also passing in a lot of the same states. And that was also a point in my time where I was on kind of the brink of making a queer self-realization and doing a lot of queer activist work. But then it felt like the whole world was against me and against us, and like there was no hope. And I kind of put the lid on that box for many more years afterward. And in 2020, I was kind of on the precipice of feeling that same way again, as if there was no hope to be myself, and that if I personally had to be responsible for everyone's reaction to me and making it through in a world that was increasingly hostile to me and people like me, that I just couldn't do it, and that maybe it would be better to just give up. And because I couldn't fight for what I needed and what we all needed as queer people in that age, in that era, to like stand on our own feet, maybe I should just give up. I was also really um, noticing beyond my own struggles during this time a lot of just worrisome trends in how the public discourse was addressing a lot of different systemic issues. So, not just legal attacks on trans people, but even it being 2020, how we were talking and thinking about and being conditioned to think about things like COVID. So I'm here in Chicago. Uh, in some ways, Illinois handled the pandemic a lot better than most other states, but there are still a lot of things that we really bungled. For many months, getting tests was virtually impossible throughout 2020. We didn't lock down quickly enough. No place really did. We didn't provide enough support for people who were working or had to work amongst the public, exposing themselves potentially to COVID during that time. And all of these institutional failures were, of course, having a consequence. Of course, we were seeing COVID numbers go up, but all that our leadership seemed to have to offer us was blaming individuals for not doing enough to stop the spread. So here we had at that time Lori Lightfoot talking a lot about how individuals were acting like criminals, lots of shaming Black youth in the city for having house parties and them, supposedly being to blame for spreading COVID. Lori Lightfoot said, if you act like a criminal, we'll treat you like one. If you have a house party, we'll lock you up in jail, even though jails in the city and everywhere were some of the worst sites for COVID spread. So that does nothing to contain the pandemic or really help anyone in the long term. And even as her own policy decisions were worsening the spread of COVID. So she was very eager to arrest individuals for taking risks and using the beach or having house parties because that was spreading COVID. But at the same time, she was opening up restaurants and trying to open up schools again and trying to uh, get, just basically represent business interests in ways that were unsurprisingly resulting in raising COVID rates. So I was noticing and really getting frustrated by this gap between the messages that we receive as individuals about what our personal responsibility is and how many powerful social systems, government systems, economic systems were failing to actually address those same issues. And I think when we really zoom out, we can see this weird toggling between systemic failure and individual blame operating almost everywhere. I think a lot of us feel immense personal responsibility to address things like climate change, to reduce waste, to recycle, to make sure that we're purchasing very conscientiously from the most ethical sources we can possibly find. But also, it's nearly impossible to find an ethical source of just about anything under capitalism. And every individual effort that we make to reduce our waste, to be conscientious, it feels like it's all just immediately wiped out by the actions of a handful of really large super polluters. There's only so much that I can do as an individual when my city's going to turn around and offer up tax cuts to Amazon to try and get warehouses built here and to try and feed more into that system of consumption and waste. Um, so I think a lot of us are feeling a lot of shame about our inadequacy and our inability to do enough to fix these social problems that we care a ton about and that we hold ourselves really responsible for, even knowing at the same time that even our most valiant, most perfect of efforts are just not going to be enough in the face of the systemic indifference and cruelty and waste. Um, so I have been thinking a lot about shame, and I was really noticing how much different levels of shame were really nested within each other. There were the kind of personal feelings that I had about being ashamed of my body, my appearance, my choices, my desires as a queer person, as a visibly trans person. There was also a shame that radiated out towards others interpersonally, because if you're ashamed of who you are, that means that you're seeing yourself through the imagined gaze of other people, right? You're seeing other people's worst possible judgments of you. And that is pretty inherently a mistrustful way of looking at the world. If I feel like I'm horrible and that everyone thinks I'm disgusting, that means I have a pretty dismal view of humanity and my neighbors and any potential community that I might have. I'm not trusting them with how I'm feeling or with my true self. And so that really manifests, or it can manifest in a lot of really nasty ways, a lot of hyper individualism and isolation and judgment also being casted out at others. If I'm feeling like I'm not doing enough to address climate change, I'm probably also feeling like most people around me are not doing enough either. And on a mass scale, this kind of attitude, this obsession with shame and personal responsibility really becomes a very fatalistic outlook of feeling like humanity is full of untrustworthy people who aren't doing enough and who are never going to take care of each other and are never going to accept me or take care of me. And that can really, I think, metastasize into some of these attitudes that we see, and we certainly heard a lot of it during 2020, of humanity is the virus, right? That humanity is doomed, that the climate apocalypse is something that we deserve because we didn't act quickly enough or make the right decisions. Humanity is on its most base level just evil and irrational and selfish, and there is no hope for the future. Um, so these levels of shame that were kind of nested within each other and are all caused by this failure to address systemic issues on a systemic level is due to something that I started conceptualizing as systemic shame. So it's the shame of, as an individual, taking on all of the responsibility and blame for far-reaching systemic social issues that are caused by our economic system, that are caused by our laws, that are caused by the actions of the nation states that we're stuck living in, and that really can only ever be addressed in a significant way through collective action. They're issues where being the most valiant and perfect of individuals is never going to be enough to address it. So here are a few questions from the book, just a little self-reflection that may be an indication that systemic shame is something that you are also dealing with. And this is certainly not an exhaustive list, but these are some aspects of how it tends to manifest from what I've seen. So you can kind of, as you just hear these questions, just kind of make a mental note of if they resonate with you, or feel free to share in the chat if any of them kind of hit you at home. Um, you're constantly looking at yourself through the eyes of people who disapprove of you. You spend a lot of time ruminating over past decisions, even relatively small ones, worrying that things would have gone differently if you'd gotten it right. You don't trust other people to behave ethically and assume that most human beings are dangerous, dishonest, or completely apathetic about the future of the world. You are hyper aware of the negative stereotypes people might apply to you based on your identity, your appearance, or even your past experiences, and carefully monitor your behavior so as not to confirm those stereotypes as true. You feel disgust or even hatred toward members of your own identity groups who do reflect those negative stereotypes. You compulsively take in news of upsetting events throughout the world, but instead of feeling empowered by knowledge, it leaves you feeling guilty and panicked. You have a difficult time imagining a future where you might feel content or that your life is worthwhile. You feel like you are carrying a heavy load of obligations, but that nothing you do in life seems to matter. Your default attitude toward yourself is mistrust and disgust. And the last one, you try to do everything on your own, and you see slowing down or needing help as a failure. So, systemic shame has five kind of core values driving it. And a lot of these values are really deeply embedded in American culture, in Western culture, and kind of just the culture that is pushed on all of us throughout the world by forces like capitalism and imperialism. And those values are personal responsibility, wealth, consumerism, individualism, and perfectionism. And these values are kind of the means that systemic shame says are they're the forms of power that it tells us to aspire towards. And they're the ways and the tools in which systemic shame tries to convince us are our source of power and are our source of political influence. That if we want to make a difference in the world, if we want to have a life that is one that is of meaning, if we want to escape shame, these are the things that we need. And we have to kind of live up to the standards of these things. And there are a lot of different issues in the world that systemic shame touches. It's both a personal feeling of blame and kind of an ideology, a belief system about how change happens and how who we should aspire to be and how we should aspire to enact change in the world. So uh, I could go on and name like 1,000 different examples of it, but here's just kind of a few um, exemplifying each one of these values in order. So personal responsibility, wealth, consumerism, individualism, and perfectionism. So how we talk about people's political participation, there's a big focus on personal responsibility. That if you don't vote, you can't complain. That if you're not putting enough energy into the political system as it currently is, then you are on the hook for any of the negative consequences, even if your vote is basically washed out by the electoral system and doesn't count for much of anything, even if all of the options provided to you in our political system do not reflect you and your interests, it's still your fault. Even if you can't get to the polls because of your job, or you can't participate because of the amount of documentation required to vote, it doesn't matter. It's still your personal responsibility to ensure that your voice is heard within a system that doesn't want to hear you. Wealth. This idea, Kowaback writes about this a lot in the book White Feminism, which I could not recommend highly enough. This idea that success under white feminism is capitalistic, personal achievement, wealth driven success. So you shouldn't try to dismantle sexism in our laws. You should aspire to be a girl boss. And that's the method of change that really matters. You shouldn't work collectively with other people of your identity group. It's about you getting ahead, you securing the bag. That is what matters. And that's when you'll know that you've made it and overcome sexism. Consumerism, the idea that we can express our political values most effectively through the things we buy, whether that is a tote bag that signals to everyone we are eco-conscious, or a hat that shows people that we are a feminist, or a mug or a t-shirt or a book that tells people that we are an anti-racist or that we believe in all lives having value or whatever. That it's what we buy and what we boycott as individual consumers, not as part of any kind of coordinated collective, that expresses our political values. Our money and how we spend it is our main way of making change. Um, a focus on individual steps, individual changes that we can make. So this is from an article in Slate criticizing white fragility as an approach, or being the only approach to anti-racism, from Lauren Michelle Jackson. White fragility being a book that makes some salient points, but at the end of the day is perhaps a little too focused on white people's self-reflection and our feelings and our personal growth journeys, rather than racism as a set of laws and practices, and institutions that continue to make and remake racism every day. That even if every individual white person completed the personal growth journey and did the work of making ourselves less racist, we would still have systemic racism in the world. And then finally, perfectionism. So we see this manifest in things like tone policing, telling someone that they cannot share their story if they are not presenting it in a perfectly palatable, politically convenient way. If they're not providing the roadmap as a marginalized person to their own salvation for us, then they don't really deserve to be heard and they're never going to really win. Or that every effort that we make towards any kind of political change needs to be perfect, needs to be perfectly packaged at all times. We have to be pure as the individuals advocating for it, or we can be blamed for not solving the problem of our own oppression. So these forces and these values really condition us to nullify our own political movements and really take a lot of the teeth out of more collective fights for systemic change, because it has us constantly obsessed with, are we buying the right things? Are we achieving enough? Are we doing the right things as individuals in the right way? Are we good enough people, rather than, again, collective action or demanding better from the systems that have made it so hard for us to make the quote unquote right choices. Systemic shame has a lot of different negative consequences because it prioritizes these things so strongly. So it tends to apply higher standards to more marginalized people. So the more marginalized categories you belong to, the more likely you are to be tone policed. The more likely you are to be expected to be perfect. And the more you are going to be blamed, again, for not solving the problem of your own oppression. Collective movements for justice are replaced with a focus, again, on individual actions and personal purity. So people lose the plot because they are so focused on themselves or on critiquing others. Not that there isn't a place for having critical conversations about, are we enacting the right strategies to foster the changes we want to see in the world? But there becomes a focus on every individual effort needing to be perfect and every individual needing to be perfect, all of the time. People are trained under systemic shame to fear and judge the other. So again, that focus constantly are on, how are other people looking at me? I can't tell people what I'm really struggling with because they're going to see me as a bad person. And so I can't really open up about anything that I am ashamed about or anything that is difficult for me to do correctly. Um, COVID, I think, is a really easy example. If I deviate in some way from what I know are the proper protocols because I'm struggling emotionally or psychologically, I can't show that to other people. I can't ask for help because I'm going to be blamed for spreading the virus and be likened to a murderer or be likened to burning the planet down in CO2 emissions. When really what I need is support to help me make the choices that I think are right. So this is kind of a dual one where you're both judging other people for their imperfections and you're also never really able to be honest about where you need help because you're afraid of others judging you. And again, that kind of global piece of shame that I've talked about earlier, humanity is seen as fundamentally evil or maybe even deserving of suffering and death. And this is where we get things like eco-fascism, this idea that for the good of the planet, humanity needs to die out and things like that, which are pretty counter to any long-term serious organizing for change. Certainly, that's going to actually help the people most impacted by climate change throughout the world. So how we got to be in this position that this value system is so widespread and touches so many different political issues is something that would take a whole other hour, at least for me to even try to summarize, but really even far longer than that. I think the book's recording time is something like 10 hours. So there's a lot of history in the book, Unlearning Shame, about how we got here and some of the economic forces and industries that have really deliberately cultivated this focus on individual action because this was a very intentional decision that a lot of industries and a lot of governments made to try and get the heat off of themselves being criticized by conditioning the public to constantly be navel gazing, blaming and shaming themselves, feeling inadequate and ashamed, and also shaming other individuals instead of working together to kind of dismantle some of these systems that got us here. And I would love to go into all of the history on that, but again, uh, it would be a long conversation. So for now, just know this: the evidence is really, really abundant that shame is not effective in motivating any kind of positive behavior change. That's whether you look in psychological research, public health research, attitude change research, just about any field that has ever examined it has found repeatedly that when people feel ashamed, they conceal themselves, they don't seek help, they are less likely to take pro-social action. Here are just some of the examples of the ways in which shame doesn't work, just some of the things that social psychological research has shown us. But again, this is just a taste. There's a lot more research in the book that, again, I could go over and over forever. Um, One of the first issues with shame or focusing on individual blame is that when we blame people for their individual actions, we ignore their social context. So if someone is doing the wrong things, if they're failing to make the right decisions, what is costly about that right decision? What is getting in the way of them making that right decision? Um, do they have the time? Do they have the money? Do they have the social support? Do they have the information to make those decisions? Or are they so boxed in by their economic and social circumstances that they can't be responsible to the standard that we might want them to be all of the time? Shame makes it really difficult to do any kind of harm reduction or to make realistic decisions about our needs. So there's a lot of shame wrapped up in even having needs of any kind: physical needs, psychological and emotional needs. Again, the COVID example is one that comes to mind for me very easily because it was one that I personally experienced a lot of shame around, feeling ashamed of having social and emotional needs that would cause me to take risks to some degree, even if they were mitigated risks. It felt like it was shameful to even acknowledge that I was making any of those decisions. Um, Lots of public health examples abound with this, whether it is sexual wellness decisions that people make, or really any other health decision that involves like any behavioral component from, you know, demonizing people for their body size, demonizing people for their uh, habits and choices around health. We know from repeated studies on this that when people feel ashamed and blamed for any choice that they make, they're less likely to be honest with themselves or with other people about what their needs actually are and what their behaviors actually are. Shame discourages self care and preventative measures. This is one that has a really serious mortality toll. We can really see this in research looking at anything from anorectal cancer patients to diabetes patients to smokers. When people feel ashamed of a disease that they have or their healthcare status or their behaviors, they seek out less preventative healthcare. They avoid doctors more, they avoid accessing healthcare more, they're less likely to be honest with people around them. They're more likely to be self-destructive in their behavior. And we know empirically at this point, there's a really robust literature showing that this really cuts people's lives short because they don't feel safe caring for themselves and asking to be cared for because they fear they're going to be demonized for their choices or for who they are. And there's probably no stronger example of this than medical fat phobia. That is one with just one of the highest mortality tolls where we see fat people not accessing healthcare because they know they're going to be blamed for being fat, held personally responsible for the fact that they exist in a healthcare system where there are almost no studies done on fat patients. There's almost no medical equipment for fat bodies. And of course, then you're going to have a lower quality of care and more negative healthcare outcomes when the system is not built for you. And at the same time, you are personally blamed for that massive structural gap. Shame provokes a physiological freeze response. So when people feel ashamed, it's harder for them to talk to others. It's harder for them to take proactive steps. It's harder for people to make decisions and process information. Everything about just the physiological stress system really shuts down when people are experiencing shame. And even a lot of the social help seeking system, if you will. It's very hard to even look at other people or engage socially in any way when you're feeling shame. Um, so the whole first half of Unlearning Shame is about all of this stuff, about the history of systemic shame, why shame doesn't work, how we got to be here, and lots of contemporary examples of the toll that it's taking today. So after I really drag you through the muck as you're reading it, the second half is about envisioning alternatives to being so focused on individual blame and shame. And the alternative to systemic shame, as I kind of conceptualize it, is something that I've taken to calling expansive recognition. The recognition piece came from my friend Jess White, who's an incredible writer and thinker. And I was really just talking to them like about like what is the opposite of being ashamed, and their great insight was being recognized. Shame is a hiding away of yourself, a turning away, a concealment. And the antithesis to that is not being revealed necessarily. It has to be being revealed on your own terms, being safe enough to be seen, safe enough where you don't have to turn away and where you are actually recognized in the fullness of your humanity, your flaws and your strengths and your neutral traits, all of you, and the social context in which you are embedded. So, not just you as a person, not just you as your individual actions, but your community, your context, your history, and everything in life around you that makes life difficult for you. And that might lead to you making choices that you're not always proud of, or may lead you to sometimes hate aspects of who you are unfairly. And that's where the expansive piece comes in. Systemic shame is all about seeing yourself as an individual only, seeing yourself as only having power in terms of what you do as an individual. And expansive recognition is about really zooming out and seeing how you're connected to everyone else. This idea from James Baldwin that suffering is a bridge, that everything that we're ashamed of, everything that's difficult and traumatic about our lives, that we are ashamed of, that we try to hide, those are the very things that connect us to everyone else, and that are our means of getting vulnerable and honest and talking about what we're struggling with and actually building movements and systems that can actually address the problems that we are all facing. And expansive recognition is also about seeing that even if your individual efforts are never going to be enough, and you're on an individual level, even if you're always feeling like you're coming up short, you don't actually need to see yourself as this atomized individual being. You are part of humanity. You are part of the earth. And every small thing that you do is part of a greater effort to foster change and build community. And and there's kind of a dialectic to it, of both feeling like, yes, I am small and humble, and there's only so much I can do, but actually that is enough because I'm not doing it alone. And it was nonsense to ever think of myself as existing alone. It's impossible for any human to exist alone. Nothing that humanity has ever done has happened alone. Um, and so I see kind of progressing away from letting shame drive us and towards kind of being more expansively recognized and recognizing other people as operating on the same kind of three levels that systemic shame does. The personal, the global, the personal, the interpersonal, and the global. So there's a core of coming to terms more with yourself and accepting yourself more. Um, that's inherently an interpersonal project. It can't just be a personal self-help journey because accepting yourself means opening up to other people. And so then that flows into the kind of interpersonal layer of starting to see other people with a spirit of trust, trusting other people with the details of the parts of yourself that you're ashamed of, and trusting other people as not being inherently evil or not being good enough, and recognizing that people are just coming from where they're at as well, and they're limited too. And so, of course, they have flaws, and of course, they've hurt us sometimes because of things they've been conditioned to believe. And then finally, those things flow out into more of a global uh, recognition of humanity's potential and recognition of the fights that we can all be in together if we do want to dismantle capitalism, change our political system, envision new solutions to things like climate change, and just really just operate in a completely different way. Recognizing that even in our smallness, we have a place in the world that matters and that we can see ourselves as part of something larger than ourselves. I think that can really help soothe some of that feeling of nothing I do matters and I'm completely alone. Um, sorry about this bar. So systemic shame has all of these really counterproductive values, and expansive recognition has contrasting values that kind of push against it. So instead of perfectionism, we have kind of acceptance. Instead of individualism, we have vulnerability. Instead of consumerism, we have coalition building. Instead of wealth, we have compassion. And instead of a focus on personal responsibility, we have humility, a recognition of our limitations. And each of these things, again, they really do have to be practiced on a collective level. It can't just end with a personal growth journey or a personal reflection journey. There is so much that I want to get into in terms of what unlearning shame can look like and some of the exercises I've developed for what it's looked like for me and others in moving out of this stuff. It's an ongoing, lifelong process, I think, especially if you are from an individualistic capitalist culture. But knowing I'm already running over time a little bit, I just wanted to leave you with a few personal reflection questions. There are a lot of exercises in the book that are all about working on getting a little bit more comfortable with interrogating your own shame, yes, but then looking outward. I don't think any of this healing can happen individually. Like that's what this whole problem is about, right? We need to stop thinking individually and we need to start taking steps to deepen our relationships and to build some of the community structures that so many of us are so desperately lacking in. So a lot of the exercises in the book are about building better, deeper, more vulnerable relationships and envisioning political change, social change, change in our communities that will help us feel less ashamed and alone, and hopefully start to tackle some of these systemic issues that have left us feeling so shitty in the first place. So, to that end, I'm going to just leave you with a few personal reflection kind of questions that might highlight some of the areas in life where you might need some change to help you feel less ashamed and atomized. All of us are approaching this from a different starting place, and all of us are struggling with different elements. So some of these questions may be useful to you about where to look next, and some of them might not be. Some of them might be things you've already tackled, which is awesome. There's certainly all things that I needed to work on and still do. Uh, so here they are for you to sit with, and then we'll get to some of y'all's questions. Do you feel that you have a valued role in your family, your friend group, and your community? And what is it? Where do you fit in? Are there people close to you who seem to really understand you? And who are they? And if not, why not? What's missing there? Why is this not advancing? There we go. During the past week, how often did you spend quality time with loved ones? So there's both the abstract, right? And there's just like the actual daily habitual practice. Um, Aisha Khan, woke scientist, if you know her, she writes a lot about this, just establishing mundane rituals that allow you to establish community with other people, things that aren't so focused on consumption, the way a lot of socializing is in especially the US, but other places too. Are there people in your local area who you feel you can depend on? Who are they, and what do you turn to them for? And also, implied in a lot of these, what's lacking? What are you not asking for help for that maybe you should? Constantly telling on myself with that question. What do you give to your community on a regular basis? And what do you get back? Does anything feel missing in your relationships? And if so, what? Finally, last two parting questions for you. What sides of yourself do you still feel that you must hide? Whether that's personal qualities, experiences that you still don't tell people about that are hard, choices that you've made, just what are you still ashamed of that isn't getting that recognition? And then the flip side of that, I think pretty necessarily, is what are you still judging or even shaming others for? Um, I think we're both playing both sides of these all the time because individualism are the tools that we've been given, um, especially under capitalism, especially in the West. So I think we all need to make changes, not just in how we think and feel about this stuff, but in how we actually behave towards others in our lives. So that is the whirlwind tour of some of the big themes in this book. Uh, there's just so many issues that I think that are touched by systemic shame. Um, I have sometimes felt like the Always Sunny Charlie meme where I'm just connecting all of these strings as I've been writing this book. So I could go on, but thank you for your patience and your listening up to this point, and I would love to hear people's questions.
Alrighty. Well, first of all, fantastic presentation. Um, really enjoyed that. And we're going to go into some of the pre-submitted questions, but for everyone watching, if you have any other questions, you can drop those in the Q&A at the bottom of your Zoom screen. I've also seen a couple come through the chat, and don't worry, I've seen or got those written down as well. So the first one is from Folly, who asks, how do you unlearn sexual shame as a physically disabled person?
Gosh, So I do want to just have caveats with this that, for the most part, I'm I have some physical disabilities, but I don't really have the experience of people with a lot of like mobility disabilities and things like that. Um, so take my perspective on this with a grain of salt, and if there's something that I seem oblivious to there, I, I I'm on the hook for that. That's legitimate. But I can map on, what's worked for me and what's worked for a lot of people that I've spoken to about this. I think it's a lot of what also works for people in the queer community. And of course, there's a massive overlap between disabled people and queer people and sexual shame. I think really surrounding ourselves with the full diversity of human sexuality really helps. Being around the freaks, and that's complimentary. If I say freak, it's always complimentary. People who are into things that have been really stigmatized, really pathologized, things that are just niche. This is something I talk about in the book, and certainly something that I let my freak flag fly about on socials as well. Um, I think when we have a little bit of a sense of humor and a sense of awareness of the sheer breadth of things people are into and things that feel good in their bodies and ways bodies can look and function and feel, that helps put things into perspective for us a lot. For me, that has been probably the number one thing in overcoming shame about who I am, how I identify, what gets me off, what I need, is just absolutely just basting myself in the sheer diversity of human sexuality. So my short answer would be like go to a furry convention, right? Go to, or remotely go to, a erotic hypnosis convention online because there are virtual ones. Like, but the real answer, of course, is find as many ways to expose yourself in the way that's like safe and healthy for you to different expressions of human sexuality, including things that are not fraught for you. Because I often find that seeing what people I care about are ashamed of and having that reaction of like, oh, that's not a big deal. Why are you ashamed of that? That's adorable. That's lovable. That's cool. You don't deserve to feel ashamed about that. That really helps map onto me. Oh, I shouldn't be ashamed of the weird things that I'm trying to hide from other people too. Um, and certainly as a trans person, that goes to shame around the body and embodiment too, being around a lot of different types of bodies, seeing lots of people naked, seeing people experiencing pleasure. And that can be physically in person or that can be remotely. There are lots of great ways to do that. But I think the more we just like really swim in those waters, the more we calm down and are less distressed thinking about ourselves and where we fit in. And yeah, puts everything in perspective a lot.
There's a lot of love in the chat for that answer. Really beautifully said. This next one is from Olivia, and it's a little long, so give me a moment to read it. It says, "Hi, Devin. As an autistic young adult, something I struggle with is feeling sort of secondhand shame when I hear others talking about someone else being lazy, unhelpful, or self-centered. Hearing my friends and family talk about people in that way has made me realize that even though they claim to understand why I can't be as productive or as socially aware as others, they actually don't. If they did, surely they would extend that understanding to people they don't know or don't like. For example, I had a friend who complained nonstop about a roommate who left his coffee cup in the sink every morning and would sometimes say abrupt and rude things. I only found out later he was autistic, and my friend asked me to assure her that nothing he did could be attributed to the autism. He was clearly just an a-hole. Conversations like that made me feel like I'm being lied to, and also like I should be ashamed of myself. I often find myself being this judgmental of others along with them, only to feel sickened later. What should I do?
Yeah, so I was really reflecting on this question today because I think there's layers to it, right? Because there's part of me that wants to say you shouldn't have to hear this stuff. I know this stuff is like putting a knife in an already existing wound for you every time you hear it, and it sucks that people have these attitudes, and I want you to be able to push back against it or step away from hearing that kind of stuff. And at the same time, I also am very acutely aware of I've had that same kind of reaction as what you're describing. And sometimes when I tell people, I wish you wouldn't judge people in that way. I wish you wouldn't talk about people like that. Maybe that guy's doing that inconsiderate seeming thing because he has a disability. People feel shamed and feel criticized for you even saying that. And they also do have a right to their own frustrations and their own messiness and their own biases that they have to work through in their own time. So both of those things are so true at the same time. And so for me, at least, I've learned to take it so much on a case by case and relationship by relationship basis that there are some people in my life that I know they're comfortable getting deep with me about it. And I can be vulnerable with them and say, when you say this, even if you're talking about someone else, it feels like you're talking about me, or it makes me worry about how you see me. And some people in my life, when I've said something like that, they can say, oh, I haven't thought about it that way. I need to think about these reactions and how I see people in general. And other people respond to it in a pretty defensive way of like, oh no, well, I don't see you like that. I'm talking about this guy. Like that guy's a dick, but you're okay. And it hasn't been really productive. Or they've lashed out, you know? Um, so I think you will know your relationships best and who you can really grapple with about this stuff. I think there are some people where you have to limit your exposure because they're just not on a level right now that they can talk about this stuff, and you know, they're not going to be able to address this for you, and you have to work on your own, disengaging from their opinions, setting some boundaries, taking care of yourself so that you kind of process anything that they say to you that like is very triggering of that internalized ableism. But then there are also people who are trying to grow, trying to work on themselves, do believe in those values in an active way and show it with their behavior. And those are the people that I think you can say, hey, I know you care about this. So can you please work on this? Can you please question your reactions to these things? And here's why it hurts me, even when you're talking about someone else. But yeah, it's a tricky balance because it's like you don't want people to shame others, but then sometimes in pushing back against it, you wind up making someone feel ashamed. So there's a lot. There's a lot going on there. It's a great question.
Definitely a lot. A somewhat related question, going back to a little bit more on autism, from Kay asks, "What's your best advice for autistic individuals and how to work together slash heal in community?"
Gosh, so many thoughts on this. Maybe a whole other book of thoughts on this. But I think we have to, a lot of us, in my experience, a lot of us have to work on developing behaviors that allow us to form the kinds of communities that we need because we have been really disempowered in society. We're told all the time that we are missing social cues that everybody else can see, and that we are seeing, hearing, and feeling things that nobody else can see and hear and feel, right? So a lot of us become really, we default to being really passive and withdrawn, being really terrified of other people, not making any gestures towards initiating or deepening relationships because we've been bit so many times in the past. So I think for a lot of us, the first stage of the journey is just kind of reflecting on a lot of that stuff and really taking some time to mourn and gnash our teeth and be pissed off about a lot of the damage that people have done to our self concepts. But then also after that, I think we do have to take behavioral steps that make it possible for us to connect to people more, initiating more in the ways that work for us. It doesn't have to be verbal, it doesn't have to be in person. Forming community doesn't have to look for us the way it looks for a neurotypical person. We have to do a lot of inventing, um, which it's unfair that we have to do that, that we haven't been given the scripts for what a family looks like for an autistic person, what a community looks like for an autistic person. But but I think we do have to develop a sense of agency in our lives and put ourselves out there in certain ways. Um, and if that sounds frustratingly vague and unhelpful, um, I have a lot of advice columns about like how to actually put these things into practice on my like Substack or Medium or wherever you read my other stuff. If you do read my other stuff, things like just going out in public in the ways that feel safe for us. And again, that can be remote. It doesn't have to be physically in person. COVID is very much a concern. Um, but slowly raising our distress tolerance through being around people, being around people who are actually going to accept us, letting people in who have shown signs that they do listen to us and care about us. And just practicing sharing more about how we're actually feeling and what we need, because we've been told for a really long time that those things don't rank. And it's normal for this to take years to get better at. Like if you're starting from what feels like square one, in my experience, it's going to take years to kind of find your people and find your community. But just because it takes a long time doesn't mean it's not worth doing. I think it means the world. It's really worth every bit of energy we can put into it.
Really beautiful. And kind of a similar question, kind of related to community, from Alana, who asks, I find myself preoccupied by the idea that I can overcome shame about parts of my life and the circumstances won't actually change. For instance, I could not have shame about my difficulty maintaining long-term friendships, but I still won't have those. Does grief have to be the trade-off to shame?
Oh, yes. Okay, so this question had me excited and foaming at the mouth earlier when I was looking at the spreadsheet. So I think contrary to like the impression that the title of the book might give off, I think the first like misconception that I want to burst is that we have to set the standard for ourselves of not feeling shame anymore. Like that again is like this manifestation of this problem of blaming ourselves as individuals for a problem that's bigger than us. So Deshaun Harrison writes about this a lot, that in their writing about um, self-loathing as a fat black person. And they talk about how, what if the lack of self-confidence that I feel is not a failure on my part, it's an indictment of the society that has made me feel lesser because I'm black and I'm fat and I'm trans. Um, and through that lens, I think it means we don't have to aspire to feeling unashamed about anything that society has made us to feel shamed about. We can hold that and realize it's not our fault, it's not a personal weakness, it's not a personal hang up to overcome. We feel ashamed of ourselves for very sensible reasons that are a reflection of the society that we live in. And I think that can also become part of the answer to letting shame guide our lives less. Because, yes, we might always have shameful messages kind of being thrown in our faces by the culture, and we might still internalize a lot of it forever. And that actually doesn't mean that it's like a failure on our part and that we need to keep isolating. We can actually talk about that shame to other people. We can find other people who are experiencing that shame, and we're not in some incomplete state that needs to like be quietly, privately worked on before we can actually bring ourselves out into the world. And and then it comes down to behavior, right? Like we don't need to feel 100% better to seek out other people who feel a lot of those same things and to try to show up for them and to try and say, okay, even if I hated my body, for example, for the whole rest of my life, what do I need to make my life worthwhile? Or if I'm ashamed of aspects of being neurodivergent for the whole rest of my life, even if I hate having sensory issues, that's a big one for me, for the whole rest of my life, what do I need from other people and from the society that I'm living in order to have an okay life, even if, again, that feeling is always going to stay with me because, if you've been feeling it for 35 years, in my case, maybe I can accept that I am always going to feel it to a certain extent. I can't undo the past that brought me here. But there are things I can change about how I relate to other people who I surround myself with, what I prioritize in my life that can make life more livable and hopefully together fight for some of the changes we need that would lead to fewer people feeling ashamed of who they are and how they work and people feeling less isolated.
There's a lot of wonderful questions in the chat and the Q&A that were submitted. We have time for just one more, so I'm going to try to combine two into one. So the first part of the question is from Lee, who asked, what was your biggest challenge in writing the book? And then second part to that from Ada, what is a seemingly less obvious part of your book that you feel extremely important for others to learn? So biggest challenges and then like something unobvious that's like a big takeaway.
Oh gosh, you're asking me to info dump, which you don't want. But the hardest thing about this book was cramming so many different elements into it There's history, there's public health research, there's social psychology, there's the fact that the books I write are prescriptive, so that means they have exercises and advice, even though by its very nature, this is a collective problem. And so again, it can't begin and end with just reading a book and journaling for yourself. You have to have support from other people. You have to be embedded in a broader community. So like cramming everything in there and making it have some kind of coherent flow and not be overwhelming is definitely a struggle. And hopefully I succeeded, but like time will tell. Y'all will be the judge of that. Um, and one thing that I think is like not the most obvious in your face part of the book, but that was still really important to me. This is just a personal hobby horse. Something called the replication crisis in social psychology. Um, this is something I use as an example in the book. Um, and it's important to me because it really is important to understanding science today. But if you're not a social psychologist, you wouldn't know about it. Um, in the early 2010s, when I was in grad school, a lot of us were on a systemic level taught to use these research protocols that have all now been widely discredited. We were taught to do things statistically and methodologically that are not sound. And that was in the service of churning out more and more publications, getting, more and more impressive lines on our resume so that we could get more and more competitive jobs. So it's this very capitalistic, productivity obsessed corner cutting that we were all told was the normal, correct, shrewd career move to do. And it resulted in something called replicate, which is just failure to replicate. A lot of scientific studies were totally discredited because no one else could reproduce them because they were all built on these really shoddy methods. And we've singled out a few individuals who are like the biggest examples of having lots of studies that were chocked full of these errors. They were made the symbol of the problem, but it was a systemic problem. We were all taught methodology that was completely craven and screwed up the state of the science and should make everybody skeptical of pop psychology whenever you see it. And it's just one of those examples, again, of like trying to find an individual person to stick the blame on something that was a bad barrel, if you will, creating bad apples. So because I'm a social psychologist and I lived this stuff and I've only seen kind of bad writing about it up to this point, a certain transphobic author wrote a whole book about it and he didn't really understand where the problem was coming from that he was describing. So I had to get some hits in there and talk about the context of that one. So forgive my info dumping here and in the book. Hopefully it's halfway interesting to anyone because it was just such an important example to me. So yeah, thank you for asking.
Love it. We love your info dumps, as they're saying in the chat. Well, that is all we have time for tonight. Unlearning Shame is on sale now. We're going to drop the link in the chat if you haven't already checked it out. And Devin, any final words for us this evening?
Um, yeah, I just saw people asked in the chat about the recording. It will be available later. If that wasn't already said, sorry, I haven't been watching the chat. Thank you so much, everyone, for being here. Some of y'all are funny in the comments. You know who you are. Thank you for being here. I'm sorry I couldn't engage more in the chat while doing all of this, but yeah, thank you so much. Have a good night.
Thanks, everyone. Have a great night.